It's October 7, 2023. The world wakes up to a horrible attack on Israel by Palestinian nationalist group Hamas that would lead to over 1,200 lives lost. The worst attack on Israel since its inception, and the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. But away from the Middle East, on the other side of the world, on the continent known as Australia, people were celebrating on the streets of Sydney. Australia made headlines as crowds gathered in front of the Sydney Opera House, chanting deeply offensive slogans. This was only the beginning of a much deeper, more unsettling reality waiting to unfold. Soon after, the facade began to crumble, exposing a lurking danger within the very fabric of Australia's multicultural harmony.
If the Australian government like it or not, if the ASIO likes it or not, if they want to deport me from Australia or not, the jihad is the solution for the ummah.
Islamic extremism hadn't come knocking on our door. It was already inside. Australia has long stood as a beacon of successful multiculturalism, a country where people from diverse backgrounds have come together to build a shared future. After World War II, the nation opened its doors wide, welcoming refugees and immigrants seeking safety and opportunity. Jewish survivors found solace here, rebuilding their lives far from the shadows of persecution. Vietnamese families escaping the turmoil of conflict settled and contributed to the growing mosaic of Australian society. People from Italy, Greece, China, and many other nations wove their cultures into the fabric of everyday life. Communities shared their traditions, cuisines, and languages, enriching the Australian landscape. Neighbourhoods flourished with the sounds and flavours of different cultures, embodying the spirit of inclusivity that Australia prided itself on. As a first-generation immigrant myself, I truly believe Australia might be one of, if not the greatest example of multiculturalism in the world. But as with everything, these ideas only flourish as long as everybody believes in them. And with the large influx of immigrants from Islamic countries and the growing influence of Salafist movements and wars in the Middle East, things started changing. One of the clearest signs of this came in 2014, when Australia experienced its first major act of violent extremism on home soil. This marked the beginning of a significant shift in the national security landscape as ideologies linked to global conflict began to influence individuals domestically. From 2014 to 2020, Australia saw a rise in extremist activities, with several incidents taking place across the country. What stood out most was the fact that many of the individuals involved were Australian citizens, homegrown radicals influenced by global movements, but also local voices. The attacks varied in method, but the underlying cause was often linked to a specific set of beliefs, especially those following the Salafi version of Islam. Salafism is a conservative, puritanical interpretation of Islam that emphasizes returning to the practices of the religion's earliest followers, often advocating for strict adherence to traditional teachings. In addition to domestic incidents, Australia became a source of individuals travelling to conflict zones overseas to join extremist groups. Over 500 Australians either made the journey or were stopped before they could leave, often to Syria. Among the most infamous was Khalid Sharif, who gained global attention after sharing disturbing images from a conflict zone. This symbolised a growing influence of radical ideologies within Australia's borders. Sharif was not alone. The rise of social media enabled other Australian figures to spread their messages, encouraging others to follow similar paths. Individuals like Neil Prakash became prominent in online propaganda, using their platforms to reach out to potential recruits both locally and internationally, further intensifying the issue of radicalization within Australia. In response to these growing concerns, the Australian government quickly expanded its counter-extremism efforts. New laws were introduced, including measures to cancel passports and, in some cases, revoke citizenship for dual nationals involved in extremist activities. By 2019, Australia had conducted 16 major operations to prevent attacks, and nearly 100 individuals had been charged with offences related to extremism. The rapid rise in these activities meant that Australian authorities were suddenly facing an unprecedented challenge. Despite these efforts, the influence of extremist ideologies had already established itself as a significant issue. The incidents, the individuals leaving for overseas conflicts, and the spread of radical ideas online were proof that this was not a distant problem confined to other regions. It was happening within Australia. And then came October 7. Let me give you a personal perspective here. As a first-generation migrant to Australia, I came here to get away from Islam, as the consequences of being an apostate were severe. I've always thought of Australia as generally much safer in regards to extremism you see in Muslim countries like Pakistan, Syria, or the UK. So imagine my shock when I realized there were a lot of people in the country who not only openly expressed sympathy for groups like Hamas, but exhibited concerning views toward other religious communities. The months that followed truly was a moment when the mask slipped. Australia had a lot of extreme elements, deeply ingrained in its community. One of the more shocking events occurred this year when the Syrian Orthodox Bishop Mari Emanuel was attacked on a live stream by a radical Islamist. Once caught, he claimed he wouldn't have done so if the bishop did not insult his religion. In the following weeks, counter-terrorism police arrested and charged 5 more with terror offences in relation to this attack. So, how did Australia's most prominent Islamic groups respond? By coming out demanding the government change how they define terrorism laws in the country. In fact, the Alliance of Islamic Groups accused the Australian government of racial profiling and particularly expressed their anger at the director of Australia's CIA equivalent, ASIO. The irony is, following October 7, the ASIO director labelled religiously motivated Sunni violent extremism as the biggest terror threat at their annual threat assessment. Unfortunately, the Australian government, led by the left-wing Labor Party, went one step further and demanded Elon Musk's X to censor the video of the incident globally. When they refused, they took X to court and eventually lost. Australia, similar to the UK and the US, saw months of violent protesting in its capital cities, led by clearly pro-Hamas elements. Anzac monuments were vandalised, the public were bullied, politicians' offices smashed up, but they went one step further. And that was to make the life of Jewish Australians, many who could trace their lineage to survivors of World War II, very difficult. In fact, reports of serious incidents of anti-Semitism in Australia have risen by 738% since October 7. Slogans have been spray-painted across Jewish businesses, schools, and synagogues, with these people even going after Jewish politicians in the country. Add to that the support the country's left-wing activists give to them, and we have incidents like this where one of the biggest office supplies retailers in the country outright refused to service a Jewish man.
Political about that. What's that?
I'm pro-Palestine.
That's okay, you're here to do a job of laminating.
Yeah, we have the right to deny jobs.
Is that an office works position or your personal position?
It is an office works. We have the right to deny jobs.
So office works position is that you're pro-Palestine and you won't take a laminating job?
That's my position, but
Luckily, he caught it on camera, and the retailer went into panic mode, pulling out every move in the PR playbook, including a visit to the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. Now, I can very easily make an hour-long video on incidents like this in Australia. I can even tell you that if any other religious or ethnic community apart from Christians or Jews were getting targeted, things would have been very different. But instead, in this video, I want to introduce you to some people who are leading some of these efforts. Speaking of efforts, I need your help in my efforts to get to 30,000 subs by the end of the year. So, if you're enjoying this video so far, please subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Now, let's get back to the video. Well, for starters, we've got burger franchise owner Hash Tyre. In his free time away from potentially giving customers diabetes, Hash spends his time leading ongoing, often violent protests in Melbourne. A Palestinian, he'd insist he's not anti-Semitic, but his vision for Palestine seems to involve an oddly utopian state exactly where Israel is now, only without the presence of, well, any Jews. And while he may claim he is not anti-Semitic, it's pretty easy to see why he is, based on things he says, and also the stuff he shares on social media. For starters, he almost certainly isn't for a ceasefire that I can see many neutrals, including many in the Australian government, want. He often parades around people wearing Hamas headbands and using the highbrow chant that I discussed in another video of mine that serves as an explicit threat to Jews. He also shared this rather interesting story on Instagram claiming Islam and democracy would never meet, and other ramblings about how Western democracy should fall before Islam. To top it off nicely, he even targets innocent buskers, where he demands you either join him or you get attacked. These buskers did end up getting attacked with their equipment destroyed, and I think he knows exactly the type of rhetoric he's currently sharing, which is why he promptly dropped out of running for a local council position. And let's look at the rather well-dressed left-wing grifter, Nasser Mashni, who also is another leading spokesperson for the Palestinian movement in Australia. Unsurprisingly, he is a criminal with convictions for kidnapping, violence, and threatening behaviour. And yet, he often finds himself riding a rather high horse. Now, meet Mohammed Sharab. Mr. Sharab is in Australia on a visa that anybody else would have needed to pass a character test for. But rules, as I have said previously in this video, don't seem to apply to this particular community. He was previously on bail for charges of kidnapping, armed robbery, multiple variations of assault and threats. And now he's pled guilty for more assault charges, the victim being Yemini from Rebel News. However, he won't serve any time. Rather, he was sentenced to 2 years of good behaviour bond without conviction.
So, there is some form of respect and gratitude and a big thank you that needs to be paid to the resistance. Long live the resistance, long live Hamas.
Ask yourself this: would somebody of another religious or ethnic background have been given such a favourable sentence? I highly doubt it. Now, I'd like to stop right there and quickly move over to certain events that happened in the UK. Bear with me, because this is very much connected to the story in Australia. Enter the Muslim vote movement. Their goal in the UK was to field as many Muslim candidates in largely Muslim areas in the UK, which, let's be honest, there's a lot of. This was so that they could influence foreign policy, especially in relation to the war in Gaza. The movement, despite odd figures here and there, was massively successful, securing as many seats as Reform UK with significantly fewer votes. And they promised an even bigger victory at the next election. Back in Australia, their counterparts were watching very carefully, and lo and behold, the Muslim Vote Australia was created. They plan to win seats from incumbent Labor Party electorates, where there are large populations of Muslims. And similar to the UK, their concern isn't about the issues in Australia. You know, like cost of living, housing, or immigration. No, it's to do with the war in Gaza, a war that Australia has no involvement with. This is what former Prime Minister Tony Abbott had to say about this.
You'd like to think that every Australian, regardless of his or her background, regardless of his or her religion, regardless of how long he or she has been in the country, you'd think once someone is an Australian citizen, people would be then doing their best to make judgments in accordance with Australia's national interests. Now, I can understand people feeling a sense of nostalgia for their homeland, but how can it be in Australia's national interest to support a terrorist organisation like Hamas against a long-standing Liberal Democratic partner, indeed our only Liberal Democratic partner in the Middle East, namely the State of Israel?
But unfortunately, that isn't what every Australian wants. In fact, the Labor Party, which forms the current government, seems to be rather lost as to what to do. The far-left party and the Greens are very clear in what they want. First, the Labor Party's Muslim Parliament member, Fatima Payman, quit because a two-state solution and a ceasefire weren't enough for her. Now, she sits as an independent representing Western Australia, but her priorities again don't appear to be with the Western Australian people. No, it's with the Palestinians in Gaza.
They're capaholics. They're also yapaholics.
The issue has now gotten to the point where Labor saw what the Muslim vote did in the UK and have caved into demands from them. This has translated into taking in more people from Gaza on rather seedy visas than all other developed countries combined. That's almost 3,000 people from a war zone, many of whom are entering Australia on temporary visas. And here's the kicker. Due to the situation in Gaza, most of these individuals don't even go through face-to-face interviews. Yes, you heard that right, we're letting people in without even meeting them. Let me be clear, I'm not saying everyone fleeing Gaza is a threat, but when you're dealing with a region that has produced known supporters of Hamas, with polling consistently showing higher than 50% for the group, Shouldn't we be a little bit more diligent? Especially when the only way to reject applicants is if they have provided material or financial support to Hamas. So what happens if they just agree with Hamas but haven't funded them? Well, those individuals could still be given the green light, and the chances are they're already here. Remember Mohammed Sharab? He makes no secret of this while committing heinous crimes. Opposition leader Pete Dutton's been sounding the alarm on this. He's right. It's an open door for anyone with extremist views to slip through. Remember, extremism isn't always about carrying a weapon. It's often about carrying an ideology. And if we're not checking for that, we're failing. The real issue goes deeper. It lies in the teachings that radicals use to justify their actions. The events that followed October 7 in Australia are a sign that radical elements exist in Australia in huge numbers, and we have a left-wing government who are already failing to address this. Similar to Keir Starmer's government in the UK, groups like Hamas and many Salafi movements use twisted teachings and turn them into tools of hate and division. We can't allow these radicals to bully us into submission like they have done in the UK. We have seen it before. When extremists push their agenda, they force concessions under the guise of religious freedom or cultural respect. And what happens? Multiculturalism begins to crumble. These radicals don't believe in multiculturalism. They don't believe in peaceful coexistence. They believe in dominance. Here in Australia, that threat is very clear. With the influx of individuals from Gaza, combined with a growing influence of radical ideologies, we're at a crossroads.
Towards the end of times when the Muslims will be fighting the Jews, the trees will speak, the stone will speak, and they'll say, "O Muslim, O believer, there is a Yahudi behind me. Come and..."
We can either bow to these forces, like we've seen elsewhere, or we can take a stand. We can't let extremists reshape the values Australia is built on. Multiculturalism only works when everyone agrees to basic principles of respect and coexistence. But many of those entering this country don't believe in those values. They see diversity as a weakness to exploit. If we don't face this threat head-on, Australia's multicultural harmony is at serious risk. We've seen this story unfold before, and it never ends well. In Lebanon, once the Middle East poster child for coexistence, fell victim to sectarian violence. Extremists exploited divisions, leading to a 15-year civil war. And decades later, the country is still struggling to recover its social fabric torn to pieces by those who couldn't tolerate diversity. When radicals are given room to operate, they target the very concept of coexistence. They aim to dismantle multicultural societies and replace them with their own intolerant, divisive ideologies. And Australia is no exception to this threat. October 7 wasn't just a wake-up call for Israel, but for us too. Radical ideologies have long been simmering beneath the surface here in Australia. If we look the other way, if we continue to allow radicals to infiltrate and influence our society, Australia's multicultural harmony will face the same fate as countries like Lebanon, the UK, and Sweden. We'll see the slow, painful erosion of the very values that make this country great: equality, respect, and peaceful coexistence. Multiculturalism works only when all communities share a commitment to those values. But many of these extremists, homegrown and foreign, don't believe in that vision. If we want to preserve the Australia we know, then we must take a stand. We must stop these ideas from taking root. Because if we don't, we'll wake up one day and find that the country we love and the values we cherish are gone. If you enjoyed watching this video, why not check out other similar ones from my channel? Remember to subscribe, hit that thumbs up button, and leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.